So I see everybody is making their way here, and we are also at the last event, and so there'll be some more people straggling in. I think this is a very interesting panel on what is really the core subject of these of this conference, and I think it's a good panel because it's a diverse panel, and I think there are people you all know. Immediately to my right is Ellen Lord, who's the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, and among her accomplishments, and something I think is highly relevant, is she spent 33 years in industry and in the private sector before coming to the Department of Defense, reversing what is sometimes the way people come and go to DOD. So she has experience with both the industry side of things and also now the government side of things. Immediately to her right is Bridge Colby, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategy and Force Development. He played an absolutely pivotal role in the team that drafted the National Defense Strategy, established the objectives for what it should be. He has a long-standing interest in China particularly that I know about, and feels very strongly about the strategy and the importance of executing it. And Horatio Rosansky is the president and CEO of Booz Allen Hamilton, and he is also an important figure in this because he's going to give us sort of the, I guess, private sector industry perspective on not just what government needs to do, not just what policymakers need to do, but also what the private sector industry needs to do to make this all work. And this event, it's not just you folks here. Like all the other events, there's a live audience across the country, and they are able to submit their questions, some of which we're going to take at the end through its RNDF app, and I believe that's being shown on Twitter, you know, hashtag RNDF. But there'll be an opportunity for people to submit their questions. So I would just like to kick it off with, I've got a few questions here that are meant to kind of stimulate a discussion among this group. I hope you don't agree with each other the whole time. And if you do,
sounds like a challenge.
If you do, I'm going to have to disagree with you. Okay. So, but as I first started covering defense issues when President Reagan first came to office, it's like dating myself, but and I watched the revolution in military affairs kind of come and go, mostly go, and the transformation philosophy that was talked about by Secretary Rumsfeld, which never really took hold. It was more of a slogan than a reality due to perhaps it was premature, perhaps the resources were there, and also the country became concerned, understandably, with 9/11 and the response to Afghanistan and Iraq. And it seems to me that for the national defense strategy and this defense transformation to occur, really there have to be a commitment and changes at the Pentagon. There has to be national policy that's supportive of it, including in foreign policy realm. There have to be the sufficient resources. And I think there has to be some degree of public support because you're talking about a strategy that's really decades long, that's going to, whoever wins the next election is going to involve a Democrat and Republican administrations and has to be supported by the public. So for Ms. Lord, the first question I have is what is it, transformation didn't really take last time. What's going to make the national defense strategy something real this time that actually is implemented and manifests and changes in an important way, transforms American defense capabilities? And what specifically does the Pentagon, does the Defense Department need to do this year and next year to make this happen? And not just something that 5 years from now we're going to have a panel about whatever happened to the national defense strategy.
Understood. So thank you, Michael, for inviting me to be on the panel, and thank you to the Reagan Institute, Roger Zackheim, for pulling this event together. In terms of evolution and revolution, we're talking about transformation. I bifurcate that into readiness and modernization. Readiness, what do we have fielded now and what can we do with it? Modernization, what can we do to upgrade our installed base, so to speak, and what can we deliver that's new? None of this is possible to follow our strategy if we have a CR. So first and foremost, we need an NDAA. We need to build on the increasing budgets of the past 4 years to really fulfill our strategy. If we don't get a budget here soon, we're going to have 230 programs that can't start. We have over 140 MILCON projects that won't be done. So to move forward in terms of modernization, I really look back to the NDS. We've been very clear on what our technology innovation areas are, and they really break down into hardware-enabled and software-defined. So I think what we have to do to make this transformation stick and focus on these modernization topics is to make sure that we have the foundational basis for this. So two of the key areas that I'm looking at for warfighting is artificial intelligence, which also bridges back into our business systems, as well as 5G, because it's going to change everything in terms of communication. What we have to do in order to get capability downrange quickly and cost effectively to the warfighter while having a resilient and secure industrial base is to make sure we have the foundational elements of software, for instance. We've got to have good software practices, the DevOps that we've signed out policies on. We need to have platforms. We need to have clouds because we need our coders to be warfighters. We need to develop in the same environment that's getting pushed right to the edge. We also need to make sure we don't have this adversarial capital falling into our supply chain. We need to have trusted capital to make sure we have trusted supply, particularly of microelectronics for 5G. So I think the way we make this transformation stick is we are focused on readiness, we are focused on modernization, and we get the defense industrial base right in terms of trusted supplies, and we keep focused on our objectives.
Well, let me just quickly follow up before moving on to Bridge. What are the couple of 2 or 3 critical decisions that DoD needs to make this year, this coming year, let's say, to make this happen?
We need to approve the rewrite of our whole overall 5000 series acquisition strategy, bifurcate hardware acquisition from software acquisition. We need to look at working with Congress to make sure we have a software color of money, if you will, because we need to develop, produce, and sustain software all at once while testing every night. And we need to make sure that we continue to bring innovative small companies into our defense industrial base in a very cyber secure way, and we can't make the barriers to entry so high that we scare away the non-traditional suppliers.
So, Bridge, let me turn to you. You were there for the takeoff. In fact, you helped do the launch. And so, are we moving fast enough in carrying the NDS forward? What do you see as the principal challenges?
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and let me add my thanks to to Roger and the Reagan Forum. It's really an honor to be here on this panel and talking about these issues. I am generally a glass half full person on NDS implementation. I mean, I think the fact that this forum is focused on the National Defense Strategy, Secretary Mattis was the one who developed it and led it, but Acting Secretary Shanahan, now Secretary Esper have both embraced it. And it's, I think, sort of that shows its institutionalization and that people who matter, whether they're in government or industry or Congress, et cetera, are taking it seriously and trying to figure out what it means. And I think it's fundamentally, it's a pretty clear strategy in the sense that it's focused on a set of problems. I think one of the distinctions from transformation is that, as I understand it, I'm not the world's expert on it by far, but transformation was a kind of this capabilities-based approach, an attempt to sort of transform in a way to develop a new set of capabilities that were always a bit ethereal or undefined, whereas the NDS is kind of simple at its core. It says we have great power competition. Our military forces need to get back into the business of preparing for strategically significant, plausible fights that matter, and they need to get after that. And so when I say I'm glass half full, and I think this is exactly relevant to this panel topic, some people say, we should go from 0 to 100. I mean, Secretary Shanahan would say that FY20 was going to be the masterpiece. Look, the reality is, yes, it's an aircraft carrier is going to take a long time to shift, but also it's not clear what success is going to look like. And I think that's one of the issues that getting at this evolution versus revolution issue. And I think General Goldfein touched on it in the sense that we don't know, the Air Force doesn't know what's going to be in the bomb bay of a B-52 or an X-37. And so there needs to be experimentation, there needs to be technology development, and I think that's one of the dramas that needs to be worked out. And what I would see success as is progressive, significant movement forward. When I look at what General Berger's saying, what General Goldfein is saying about what they're talking about for the next budget, but also for force planning over the FYDP and beyond, that tells me these people are taking this seriously.
Yeah.
And it's also, one of the distinctions, I think, from third offset. In a lot of ways, the National Defense Strategy builds on the third offset. It couldn't have happened without the vital work of the third offset. But it's saying, we're not saying that technology is the overwhelming necessarily part of the answer. It's a critical constituent part, but there's also got to be readiness. There's got to be force employment issues, operational concept development, posture. But also that, the third offset tended to look far. And the NDS does look far, but it's also saying, there is risk in the next 5 to 10 years too. And so I don't think there's a clear answer. I think one of the reasons why this panel is important and this issue is important is how do we balance risk? How much sort of big rolls of the dice do we take to get the kind of capabilities that are really overwhelming in the 10 to 20 year period, but how do we do that without hollowing out the force in the near term? And I think that's one of the critical issues that I think people are actually genuinely wrestling with, and which makes me sort of glass half full.
May I build on that just for 1 moment?
Well, let me just, you can in a second, but let's just finish out our group here because that's my mission. So, Rosansky, I just want to give everybody sort of on the playing field here. So sure. What, from a Booz Allen perspective, from an industry perspective, how do enterprises need to change themselves to participate in this project?
So I think what we're talking about is the creation ultimately of a digital supply chain. The ability to do all of these things in a way that is both faster, and a lot of the discussion today by the service chiefs and by everybody has been about speed. Yeah. But also much more software-enabled, software controlled. As Secretary Lord said, we need to go to software-defined everything. And then ultimately we need the talent and the base of talent that is going to undergird all of that and make it come alive. And the challenge there is not whether we can create it, is whether we can scale it. I'll give you our example. We're trying to build 5,000 data scientists over time. Now, for a company of 27,000 people, that's ambitious, that's a big number. But if you think about the fact that there are somewhere between 5 and 6 million people that work in national defense, all in, we're talking about training potentially millions of people to operate in this environment at this speed. And that is a national project that private sector, government, and academia need to engage in.
Okay, I'm going to give you a chance to say what you want to say, but let me just ask a leading question, then you can say what you were going to say anyway. So,
media training, yeah.
Yeah. One question I have as an observer, not a practitioner, is it seems that there are a few headwinds that the NDS is running into. And one is resources. And if you look at the congressionally mandated study on the National Defense Strategy, they project that a 3 to 5% real growth would be necessary to carry that out. Now, I think it's already clear nothing like that is going to happen, and that it seems very possible the Pentagon will have to make do with current levels of spending and perhaps even a decline in real terms over the ensuing years. And also, despite the focus on Russia and China is the main long-term threat and Russia is the proximate threat, the U.S. is finding itself again drawn into the Middle East, most recently with the Pentagon's inability to say clearly whether they're deploying up to 14,000 troops in the Middle East or not to augment our force. Many of those would be naval. It's not Desert Storm. But the Iran issue continues to kind of pull at the at the American government. Can you implement the NDS and do all the good things you want to do without significant real increases over the next 5 years? And what choices will that force you to make?
Well, we know resources are limited and we are not going to have increasing budgets. So what that does is create an imperative to look at these modernization areas that we're focused on in terms of what do we already have. And we cannot just go for great technology. We have to look at systems that are interoperable in the multi-domain battle that we are in. So that forms a set of conditions, constraints that we have to operate under. And I think we can move forward and do what we need to do if we look at our new programs in terms of how do they interoperate with what we already have. How do we sustain them? How do we deal with the intellectual property around them? How do we deal with all the different business aspects of this to get the most affordable solution that gives us the greatest payback? So there is, I think, much more to it than just talking about transformation and innovation. To what Bridge was saying, it really gets back to being very, very pragmatic about what do we have today to fight with tonight and what do we need to do to make that better. And there's a lot in terms of software that we can do, and we need to come up with systems so we have data standards, we have consistent platforms, we have clouds we can go to so that we can continue to incrementally roll out capability, because we can't make everything from scratch again. We need to make what we have for an installed base better with what we're developing.
Sorry, your question being on is it going to be possible to implement the NDS?
Well, is a challenge to implementation of the MDS the reality or the fact that American policy is such that, let's say with the maximum pressure campaign, that the U.S. military and the Defense Department has to certainly keep at least one eye on the Middle East, and far from disengaging from the Middle East. People hope there's certainly not going to be another conflict there, but it's certainly a very tense time.
Well, I mean,
right now.
I think these problems or challenges were completely foreseen in, I think by the leadership in the development of the National Defense Strategy. On the resources part and on the Middle East part as well. Secretary Mattis, I think to his abundant credit, among other things, he made a very clear set of decisions about what to deprioritize in the National Defense Strategy that clearly communicated and assumed the political risk to himself and to the leadership. And that included a fundamentally different approach to the Middle East. And I think the NDS is basically a logic. It is not, and I think Secretary Mattis was very clear about this, that he did not want a 10,000-mile screwdriver kind of approach. He did not want a whole schematic like a sort of thing, but rather a framework. I think actually the way General Goldfein was putting it was actually quite nice. It's a framework and a guide. It's a way of thinking about questions, and it's a narrowing of the set of the problems. And basically the NDS is saying, look, China, first and foremost, China is the first state, it's the first time in 150 years the United States will face a country that is as large as we are in economic terms. Russia is smaller, but still a major power, which has significant military capability in the European theater with respect to our NATO allies. Iran is simply a pale shadow. Now, that's my term. That's not the NDS term. The NDS doesn't say that Iran is not a problem. But fundamentally, as my critical colleague Jim Mitri has put it in a very good article in the Washington Quarterly, we got to get right on the primary scenario first. If we lose a war against China or Russia, which is plausible, as the NDS Strategy Commission rightly said, that is plausible. That is a kind of a situation that A, will be extremely difficult to reverse, if at all, and secondly, would have catastrophic effects on the international system. Iran, I think General Berger put it very nicely, is in the kind of Desert Storm analogy. Iran is a situation that is handleable in a different way. And I think there are more tectonic ways and kind of more structural ways the NDS tries to get at this issue in a different approach to, say, presence. For instance, the National Defense Strategy talks about combat credible forward presence. One of the reasons I've been very critical of some of what I see as loose thinking on more deployments to the Middle East is what exactly are those designed to do? I think Senator Hawley was right on this week when he was questioning some of the Pentagon representatives about what is it that they're designed to deter. And the answer was something like regional stability, which is, as he said, an endless goal. We want our military forces to be prepared to defeat as the NDS basically says, the red theory of victory, and that is in doubt. And if our air, and if for instance, the Air Force's wargaming that they've been talking about, and you know a lot about, Michael, if they're focused on defeating the red theory of victory, however that might be, that could be with bows and arrows. It's not going to be, but it doesn't all need to be kind of whiz-bang stuff. It could be a combination of these kind of capabilities. Then we're moving in the right direction. And I think this is possible. The president was very clear that he does not want us to have this same kind of approach to the Middle East. This is not a binary decision. This is not we're going to get out of there entirely, but we need to have a different approach. Secretary Mattis used to talk about by, with, and through, and so forth, and I think there are a lot of ways we can do that. Certainly on the counterterrorism front, I shouldn't say we, our excellent military forces, our intelligence services, et cetera, have become very good at this. But it's a false dilemma. Some of these, putting 28,000 troops in the Middle East, that's not a reasonable course of action in my view.
Michael, to build on your question, and the NDS recognizes that in the future and in the next conflict, the private sector is going to be driving much more innovation than it has in the past. It's a breath of fresh air to actually have that out there as a real point of conversation. It's been part of Secretary Lord's agenda to bring all of that in. I met a few months ago with one of our major technology partners. They spend on R&D more than the totality of Booz Allen's revenues. I was just up north in the Bay Area. Before coming here, I met with another one of our tech partners. I hadn't seen them for 18 months. Their entire technology platform has turned over at least once, possibly twice, over that time frame. If we can harness that opportunity, we can actually get a lot more done by leveraging things that are already out there, that already exist. That's why I go back to this notion of a digital supply chain, because it is a different approach to getting that done than the way we've done it regularly.
So it seems that a lot of the relationship between the DoD and industry is changing. The industry is not as nearly dependent on the Defense Department as a market. A lot of the innovation is not going to be done necessarily in government labs. It'll be done in the private sector. It's a complicated relationship, particularly out in this part of the world. There's some people who don't even want to work for the government. What do you need to do to make this sort of new partnership or new collaboration with the private sector work is the way you need it to work to carry out these changes and to tap the innovation that may come more from the private sector than from the government?
We have to innovate on the business system side just as quickly as technology innovation is taking place. And that means coming up with lots of different acquisition pathways and different ways to do business. And frankly, Congress over the last 4 or 5 years has given the department an enormous number of authorities. We haven't quickly translated those into policy and instructions, and that's typically because we're extremely risk adverse. We don't want to make mistakes and so forth. What we're doing is leaning forward and saying we will put out very wide policy, start the experiential learning, get the cycles in, make some mistakes, but fail small and fail fast and keep going. So I think the way that we're going to attract those commercial companies that we need to be part of the fight with us is to make it easier. But we also have to make sure that we fund them to do so. So we have limited budgets. We just talked about resources. What we're trying to do is create an ecosystem where we're trying to keep what I'd call the adversarial capital away from our small technology companies, especially a lot of those that were started with US government funds. So we are trying, from a DoD perspective, to articulate what our needs are in specific areas, applications, and then bring together what we call trusted capital providers, as well with vetted small companies, articulate the demand signal, and introduce them. We like to think that capital markets are extremely efficient, and they typically are. However, they aren't efficient enough to keep away this adversarial capital that causes us to go and have to work with CFIUS and our other sort of defensive mechanisms.
Mr. Rosansky, what does the Pentagon need to do?
A lot of what we're talking about is along those lines. I am very optimistic because on the experimentation front, we are seeing more things getting tried, more acquisition approaches getting deployed, more opportunity to bring in new technology into missions than ever. And that is all the an excellent starting point. The real challenge is going to be that to go from the lab to the field, the scaling process across the size and might of the Department of Defense is not a straightforward process. There's very few small companies that can really support artificial intelligence deployment throughout DoD. And so how do we actually enable that to happen? How do we create the mechanisms? Secretary Lord talks about an ecosystem, the ecosystem that will actually create that. That is frankly what we're trying to focus our efforts on, is how do we become the technology insertion partner for DoD on these kinds of issues, because we see that as a pathway to the future.
So just before coming over to this panel, I think we all heard from well, all the service chiefs about how they were moving out and doing pursuing the National Defense Strategy. And the Marine Corps Commandant has a policy guidance about really rethinking in some fundamental ways what the Marine mission should be. General Goldfein for the Air Force has his multi-domain command and control and his vision of every sensor, every shooter. The Army's launched into its own kind of project with its Futures Command and a very ambitious modernization program, and the Navy is doing what it's doing. And maybe at this stage of the game, that's all appropriate. The services we're sort of exploring, they're trying different things, but question I have is, how is all of this going to be brought together into some sort of coherent military strategy? Where are the major exercises to test and do this, and who's going to do this, and when are they going to do this? You're the Pentagon.
Okay, I was hoping you were going to call on me. I'm waiting. I'll tell you, these are not independent, pillars of excellence working on their own. I give Secretary Esper an enormous amount of credit in that he has brought the military side into a lot of the meetings that typically used to just be the civilian side. And every Monday, all the COCOMs call in a civets, and we have the service secretaries, the chiefs, all of the unders there, and we talk about strategy with, John Rood and the policy team. We have the joint staff there, and we're in this together. So this isn't a series of islands working, and we understand, again, it's an interoperable, multi-domain battle, and unless we have C2 that works across, we're not going to get where we need to be. So we are rationalizing AOR by AOR, who we're partnering with in terms of partners and allies, what our objectives are there from a warfighting point of view, and then what's the materiel you need to be there, and we're drafting exercises. On the other side, from the acquisition side of things, we at OSD, I look at us like corporate to the operating units being the services, and then we have a very large board of directors in Congress. And what we're doing is translating that all to work together. But bi-weekly, Will Roper and Bruce Jetty and Hondo Gertz, we all sit down together and talk about what we're doing and how we do it. So this really isn't a bunch of, it is individual efforts, but they're coordinated. So I think I'm much more bullish than you are about how we're working together within the department.
Well, how will you do it in terms of like joint requirements? I guess you don't want it to be so rigid that it's a top-down process entirely. But how are you going to...
So you talk about what the warfighting goal is, and then the question is, what is the art of the possible with what we have today? And then what are those incremental investments we can make to really get a step function change in capability? And I mean, that's the whole budgeting process, which we spend many, many, many hours debating where those dollars should go. And that's not, that's a team sport. Everybody's there at the table. table. So there have been quite a few iterations over the past 4 months about where we put our money and then how our war fighting plans are changing. So it's one day at a time, but it's rationalizing what we're doing in terms of investing in capability. Take electronic warfare. We have an electronic warfare council where we look across what every single service is doing to make sure that what we're doing is complementary, not duplicative, and that we can all communicate with one another and there's no fratricide out there. So there are a number of mechanisms inside the building to deal with this. It's not perfect, but I will tell you, we're getting a lot of cycles in and we're getting better and better.
Bridge, Secretary Esper, when he was at the Army, had his famous night court procedure of transferring resources from, I guess, some Army programs that he deemed to be less of a priority to things the Army wanted to pursue. General Goldfein's talked about something similar for the Air Force. What do you see as, especially in a resource-constrained environment, which I think is just reality, what do you see as the really looming big decisions, potential trade-offs that the Pentagon and also the Congress will need to contemplate over the years?
Sure, you're talking about force structure in particular? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just briefly on the previous point, I think this is a critical point, and I think having, you know, the logic of the NDS is to try to give coherence and concision to the problems, and then what should be derivable from that is some relatively specific but not perfect metrics for success. And that requires some idea of a joint concept. And I think the NDS Strategy Commission rightly dinged the department for not necessarily having a clear story on that. The services seem to be doing a lot. You know, if you see the sevens, the parts of the organizations that work on doctrine and operational concept, there's a lot of energy there and there's a lot more investment. I'm not sure we're seeing it come together yet. That might not be terrible since they're still working it all out, but that's definitely where we want to see, because then that joint concept should tell us what we need to buy and what we don't need to buy. So we don't necessarily know the answer to that question yet. I mean, I think General Goldfein, I mean, he hasn't said this himself, but the words you get out of the Air Force, I mean, short range aviation that's not very survivable, that's, you know, high cost, would be some of the things that are you know, a space that is highly vulnerable and too boutique. The Marines, General Berger has made clear that amphibs are potentially something that needs to be looked into. I think in the case of the Navy, I mean, the Navy, I think, you know, if you love the aircraft carrier, you've got to make the aircraft carrier relevant in the most strategic, significant, stressing scenarios. You can't say the carrier is something nice to float around and wave the flag. That's too expensive in an era when we have to make hard choices. And on the whole, I think, you know, in the past, there tended to be a little bit of a capability versus capacity debate. I think for a while, as Secretary Mattis made clear, I think we need to be focused on capability because we need to get the right stuff. But at some point, we're going to have to get up into the capacity way in a way that is sustainable on cost. I also want to say, it's, you know, people tend to focus on force structure, and that's totally fair. But this is why the Middle East thing is so important: is we got to bring down force employment. You know, we need our people to be going and training for the high-end contingency. I mean, my favorite example, there's an F-14 outside. You know, when Ronald Reagan was president, the most famous movie about the American military was Top Gun, which is literally about a training school. But they were training to, ironically, you know, they don't actually say the Soviets in the movie, but it's obvious. You know, that is what we actually want to get the military back towards. Doesn't mean we don't have some ability, especially with, say, special operations forces or certain parts of the Marine Corps and so forth, or, you know, light infantry, to be able to deploy. But we really have to be able to make these hard choices. And I think one of the fundamental things that I'm very, you know, emphatic about is I believe our system is capable of strategic discipline. I mean, we have done it in the past, and we are capable of it today. And I think, you know, I really want to commend, for instance, Chairman Inhofe and Ranking Member Thornberry's piece in Roll Call yesterday, which just hit the nail on the head. And it says, you know, this idea that politicians don't get it is a myth. You know, you look at what Senator Hawley's saying, you look at what Congressman Gallagher is saying, it's a myth. You know, if the Pentagon puts the right stuff out there, explains it, and builds the broader understanding, we can have the discipline and make the hard choices.
Michael, can I come at this in an orthogonal way, because I'm not a policy person? But it struck me when I walked in here yesterday for the first time that there's those cars sitting out there, the police car and everything else, that's a new exhibit. There's exactly 0 lines of code in any of those cars. A car coming off an assembly line today has 150 million. lines of code. That has much how far the world has changed. If we talk about competition with China, we're talking about it as a technology competition. I deeply believe it's a talent competition underneath all of that. And as much as there's a lot of effort going on in that, training the workforce, the entire workforce, to actually be able to operate in this digital world, to be able to, from acquire to deploy, to train, to execute in a multi-domain space, is a major undertaking. It's going to take years, and there's a lot to do there.
In the great power competition rubric, we talk about China as the longer-term challenge, Russia is the more proximate challenge. That might be a mistake to assume the Russians power is going to wane over the years. But those are very different kind of strategic situations, very different types of militaries, very different situations altogether. Do you need different sets of capabilities, so to speak, and structure and technologies to deal with China vis-a-vis Russia, or is there sufficient commonality that if you can lick one problem, you've got the other one covered?
You're asking me?
Sure.
Okay. So I think that we know we have to fight more than one conflict at a time. So we have to optimize on different types of conflicts. And we know with Russia, we have different challenges than China. So what we do is try to optimize for both of those with limited resources. So I think you do have to do it simultaneously, but you look at what you can do each place. I think overarching all of that is the criticality of the nuclear triad. That is our deterrent. So we need to start there. We have zero margin. We have to continue to modernize while we sustain what we have. But then we move on to look at, tactical air. We look at sea power. We look at what we have for vehicles. We look what we have in general, and we have to look at this as a multivariable equation solving for the highest probability incidents. So it's all about choices, and it's taking what we have for assets and being able to tailor and scale to what the fights are. So we have no choice. We have to.
Rich, what's your perspective on that?
Well, so China is the top, and I push back on your characterization of it as a long-term threat. In the article that you wrote, I had a quote on that exact point. So I read your own article, but
some of the Pentagon and Army outputs, they say, well, Russia is going to crest as a threat in 2028, and then after that, in 2030, China then becomes a more serious worry, and then maybe this is just the bureaucracy in action that allows you to sequence some of what you do, but maybe...
I agree with you in the sense that Russia is a proximate threat, but China is a now problem and a long-term problem. If we treat it like a long-term problem, it'll be a now problem for sure, because it'll create openings. I think in practice, there's often a lot of commonality. For instance, the Air Force, obviously there's specific things that might be for different systems, but in general, Air Forces are generally pretty usable in various scenarios. Naval forces also tend to be, Europe is obviously more of a terrestrial theater, so the Army has a more, kind of traditional established role. I think the Army is going to have to think about increasingly, and I think you see what General McConville and others have been talking about, more of a concentration on the Pacific. But this is also a critical point, and a really critical point about the NDS. Line of effort 2 on alliances and partnerships is more than just a talking point. It's really a different approach. Secretary Mattis, I think, always says he's never fought in a U.S.-only formation. I think the logic of that kind of parable, if you will, is that he wants the American military not to assume that it's going to be doing things just by itself. And this is going to be uncomfortable for the American military. It's going to be uncomfortable for our allied militaries, which are going to be asked to do more. But I think in Europe, we're really going to have to look, obviously, at Germany in particular, but also the Scandinavian countries. I've been encouraged by the Swedes have actually made some significant policy decisions to up their capabilities, the Finns, the Norwegians, the Danes. Obviously, the Poles are doing a job. So we're going to have to slot in together. But I think, this gets a little bit into the simultaneity issue, but from a force development point of view, I think it's a fairly manageable problem.
Okay, at this stage of the game, we're turning to the questions that have been submitted through the app and from the audience and people watching. So from Ms. Lord, with the rollout of new cyber requirements with the CMMC, how will companies, particularly small one, essential to transforming for the future, be able to be innovative in light of the associated increasing security costs?
Understood. So the cyber maturity model certification is generically what ISO standards are for quality. Right now, we know that we have incredible vulnerabilities due to cyber threats. We really are at a cyber war to some extent. So it is not practicable to not have some level of standards that have to be met. And these can't be a trade like cost and quality, schedule, and so forth. So we have rolled out a 5-tier set of standards. Now, the challenge is that we know our most vulnerable links are not the first, second, third tier in the supply chain. It's 4, 5, 6, 7, often very, very small companies. So what we look to is our primes to help those small companies. We also look at the department as having resources to help bring those companies into compliance. We actually, in the department, have worked very, very closely with a variety of industry associations with listening sessions to understand what are the challenges, because we understand there's a challenge and we don't want to lose those small companies. We actually have a couple very innovative concepts that have just recently been put out to us to consider about how to deal with this in terms of broader certifications that are easier for small companies. So I think in the next 3 months you'll hear more about that. We don't have it solved right now, but I will say that cybersecurity is critical. We understand the challenge to small companies. We are not going to put small companies out of business. We need them, and we will find innovative ways to help make them cybersecurity secure with the help of our large primes as well.
There's a second question for you as well, but if the rest of the panel wants to chime in, that's good too. You mentioned the criticality of microelectronics for 5G. Can you talk a little about the importance of secure, reliable, state-of-the-art microelectronics to maintain our technological advantage?
Absolutely. Right now, we are very threatened by the fact that we do not have a safe and secure supply of microelectronics. We made the move about 10 years ago in defense to try to cost reduce, to try to take advantage of commercial industry, all good, but there were some unintended consequences when you buy things off of price lists where you have 1 or 2 performance requirements stated. You don't realize what else is going on in there, and we actually have gotten a lot of problematical microelectronics in our systems that have compromised things. So not only do we have an issue moving forward towards 5G, we have an issue in sustaining what we have today. And this was frankly a topic of conversation at Secretary Esper's level. We just a couple weeks ago had a whole series of industry partners in, as we did this morning for a breakfast as well, to talk about these challenges. And I've set this as one of our critical goals for calendar year 2020, in that we collectively have to find a way to have trusted sources. And that doesn't particularly mean an isolated entity to develop these capabilities. It means working with the current industrial base, because this is not important just for defense. It is for banking, it's for the medical market, and so forth. So a huge area of focus for us to sustain what we have today and develop what we need tomorrow.
And then the last question is, it's a question about sole source awards. And it's looking at the largest new acquisition programs from the Army, the OMFE, fighting vehicle, and the Air Force ballistic missile, GBSD, are looking like sole source awards. And the question is this a problem being created by the changing acquisition approach? Are you entering a world of no competition?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to comment on open competitions right now. I will say competition is our friend. We want competition, and that's why I personally do not believe in mucking around and having government-directed sources for a variety of subsystems for a large system. And I think what we need to do is continue to encourage those small, innovative companies and our mid-tiers as well. I think we have a lot of very, very good competition going on, and I'm committed to generating even more.
Okay, well, that wraps up our panel here. I think it was interesting discussion with people coming from, very different backgrounds and expertise. And I thank you for your time and for a productive and serious discussion about what just as a journalist observer, I think is really one of the central issues now in national security.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.